The silence was the most dangerous thing about the estate. A vast, echoing vacuum that swallowed sound and replaced it with the heavy, measurable weight of expectation. Elena Petrovna knew danger. It was not the sharp, immediate threat of a knife blade. It was the slow, consuming kind that eroded the edges of your soul. This estate, built of cold, imported black granite and glass, felt less like a home and more like an architectural menace, a fortress designed to keep the world out and the secrets in. She had signed the contract, knowing the risks. Nikolai Volkov was not a man one simply worked for. He was a proprietor of fate, a man whose name was whispered in circles that never saw daylight. She was hired to care for his 2 young children, but everyone knew the true job. Discretion. Absolute, unyielding discretion. The drive from the gate to the house took 7 minutes, winding through pristine, frozen landscape. When the imposing iron doors finally opened, Elena stepped out of the warm sedan and into the sub-zero air, pulling her sensible wool coat tighter. "Welcome, Elena." A woman with severe silver hair and an expression of permanent disappointment greeted her. "I am Zina. I manage the domestic staff. You will find your quarters are separate but adjacent to the children's wing. Meals are at set times. Your duties begin at 6 a.m. sharp." Zina's voice was dry, like old parchment. There was no warmth, no welcome, only rules. "Understood, Zina. Thank you." Elena's voice was steady, a conscious effort to project competence, not fear. As she was guided through the vast, dimly lit hallways, where every piece of art looked both priceless and vaguely threatening, Elena felt the pressure mounting. This house was too quiet for children. It was a mausoleum of wealth, waiting for its master to breathe life, or death, into it. She was shown the children's rooms, bright and surprisingly normal spaces that seemed jarringly out of place within the Gothic structure. She met 8-year-old Victor, intense and watchful, and 5-year-old Daria, who clung to Zina's skirt and refused to meet Elena's eyes. "They are disciplined," Zina cautioned, leaning in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush that felt louder than a shout. "Do not confuse their quiet with softness. And the master requires absolute peace when he is in residence. You are invisible when he is here. You do not speak unless addressed. You do not look at him. You do not look at him." The instruction was impossible, a gravitational command that guaranteed collision. Elena was unpacking her meager belongings in her small, functional room when the floorboards shifted, not with noise, but with the pressure wave of a presence. She didn't hear a door open. She felt the temperature of the air drop several degrees, felt the electrical current in the room spike and then flatline. He was standing in the doorway. Nikolai Volkov. He was taller than the photograph suggested, a study in lethal efficiency. Dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his broad shoulders filled the frame, eclipsing the hallway light. His hair was the color of midnight, stark against the pale, almost marble-like symmetry of his face. But it was his eyes that stopped the world, glacial, intelligent, and utterly devoid of mercy. They were the color of steel, forged in deep winter. He didn't move, yet the room contracted around Elena. She felt the sudden, alarming need to check her pulse, to confirm she was still inhaling oxygen. "Elena Petrovna?" His voice was low, resonant, a sound that didn't travel through the air but vibrated directly in the chest cavity. It was a voice accustomed to obedience. She turned slowly, deliberately, meeting his gaze for one shattering second before forcing her eyes down to the knot of his tie. She knew this was the first test, the first delicate dance on the wire. "Mr. Volkov," she replied, her own voice steady, though her throat felt lined with dust. "I was told you possess exceptional references. A master's degree in child psychology. Experience in high-stress environments. That is correct, sir. You understand the terms of your employment here are not typical. I understand the need for complete discretion, sir, and the safety protocols required for your children. He took one step into the room. One simple step. But the effect was the equivalent of a distant explosion. Discretion is secondary to loyalty, Elena, and safety protocols are handled by men with rifles, not women with diplomas. Your job is to stabilize the atmosphere, to ensure my children do not sense the friction of the world outside these walls. He paused, and the silence that followed was deafening, heavy with unspoken transactions. You look at me, he observed, his tone flat, neutral, yet carrying the menace of a rising tide. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the pattern of the Persian rug beneath his polished black shoes. I apologize, sir. I was ensuring I could hear you clearly. A flicker, perhaps of amusement, perhaps of impatience, crossed his features. It was too fast to read, gone before it registered. You will be here for 6 months. You will not leave the grounds. You will not use personal communication devices. If you fail in your duties, I do not send you away, Elena. I erase you. The word erase was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm authority of a man detailing the weather. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, sir. He stood for another moment, a monolith in the space, his presence absorbing all the light and heat. Then, just as silently as he arrived, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the hallway. Elena did not move for 5 minutes. She pressed her hand against the wall, needing the solid anchor of the structure beneath the spinning sensation in her head. She hadn't just met her employer. She had crossed into the orbit of a black star. The magnetism was overwhelming, an invisible force pulling her toward an absolute zero. The day settled into a strained routine. Elena spent the afternoon with Victor and Daria, finding their silence less a sign of discipline and more a symptom of profound isolation. Victor was brilliant, his questions sharp and probing, clearly missing the stimulation of a normal school environment. Daria was withdrawn, finding comfort only in Elena reading aloud from worn, fantastical storybooks. Dinner was a solitary affair for the staff, in a small, sterile dining room. Zena watched Elena with hawk-like intensity, ensuring she ate quickly and sparingly. By 10 o'clock, the house was submerged in total, impenetrable darkness. Elena had checked on the children, ensured they were fast asleep, and retreated to her room. She sat by the window, staring out at the floodlit, snow-covered grounds, where she could see the silent, patrolling shadows of armed guards. The estate was a cage, exquisitely gilded. She tried to rationalize the encounter with Nikolai. He was testing her strength, her resolve. He needed to know she wouldn't break. The danger was intellectual, not physical. She repeated the mantra until her fear subsided into a dull, manageable ache. She changed into a simple silk nightgown, brushed her hair, and climbed under the heavy duvet. She was exhausted, the tension of the day weighing her down like lead armor. Just as her mind began to drift towards sleep, the shift occurred again. The familiar crushing displacement of air. Elena's eyes snapped open. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint silver light of the moon, reflecting off the snow outside. He was standing precisely where he had stood this afternoon, in the doorway. But this time, the architectural precision of his suit was gone. He was wearing nothing but the heavy, charged air of the room. The sight of him was not an invitation. It was a physical blow, a sudden, blinding flash that stole breath and logic. He was sculpted from shadow and tension, his body a map of controlled power. Elena pushed herself up against the headboard, the thick silk of her nightgown suddenly feeling transparent and meaningless. She did not scream. She could not breathe. The air had been sucked out, replaced by a dense, suffocating electricity that bound them together. She remembered Zena's strict command. You do not look at him. But now, he commanded the opposite through the sheer force of his presence. His eyes, dark magnets in the moonlight, were fixed on hers, demanding recognition. There was no lust in his gaze, only a terrible predatory focus, the intensity of a man about to claim what he knew was already his. He was not asking for permission. He was announcing the collision. "Elena," he whispered, and the sound was a devastating confession of intent. He took one slow, deliberate step toward the bed. The step didn't cover distance. It shattered the fragile psychological barrier Elena had desperately tried to erect. The risk was no longer of a broken contract or a lost job. The risk was absolute, total destruction of the self. She felt the overwhelming, undeniable pull, the invisible, inevitable gravity of his orbit, and knew that the rules of the house, the rules of her life, had just been violently rewritten. He reached out a hand, not to touch her, but merely to rest his palm on the bedpost beside her head. The proximity was an inferno. "Tell me," Nikolai commanded, his voice barely audible, yet vibrating deep within her core. "Tell me why you looked at me this afternoon." Elena swallowed, the fear sharp and metallic. She knew the wrong answer would condemn her. She also knew the truth was the only weapon she had left. "Because, Mr. Volkov," she managed, her voice a brittle whisper that defied the crushing silence, "you are impossible to ignore." A dark smile, the barest upturn of the corner of his mouth, acknowledged her defiance. It was less satisfaction and more confirmation of a hypothesis. He leaned in, his shadow enveloping her, the scent of expensive leather and cold night air filling her lungs. The psychological pressure was immense, threatening to flatten her entirely. "Good," he murmured, the word a promise and a threat tangled together. "Because tonight, Elena, I require your full attention." The collision was imminent. The world was holding its breath. The atmosphere did not just thicken, it solidified, becoming a pressure chamber where the only sound was the frantic, trapped beat of Elena's heart. Nikolai did not touch her, not yet, but the space between them was dissolving, replaced by a devastating vacuum that pulled them together with inescapable force. His gaze was the only light in the room, sharp and unforgiving, burning away the boundaries of her self-control. When he finally moved, it was not with haste, but with the terrifying, unhurried certainty of a predator closing a preordained distance. He settled onto the edge of the mattress, the slight depression of the heavy springs, a seismic shift in Elena's universe. He was an object of such intense focus that all other reality faded. His skin, pale and flawless in the faint moonlight, seemed to radiate a cold, inherent power. Elena's mind was a frantic, useless machine, processing survival protocols that had just been rendered obsolete. She was not afraid of the physical man, but of the immense, intelligent mind behind the steel eyes, the mind that knew, without being told, every weakness in her emotional architecture. "You came here for peace," Nikolai stated, his voice a low rumble that resonated through the mattress and into her bones. It was not a question. "I came here for work, Mr. Volkov," Elena countered, gripping the duvet so tightly her knuckles whitened. "The two are mutually exclusive in my world, Elena. You are here to stabilize my children, and I am here to destabilize you." He lifted his hand, and this time there was no pretense of distance. His fingers brushed the curve of her jaw, a feather-light contact that detonated 1,000 silent alarms inside her. The touch was possessive, cold, and utterly demanding. It was an invisible brand, marking her territory not with heat, but with a sudden, profound chill that rooted her to the spot. "You intrigue me," he continued, his thumb tracing the line beneath her ear. "Your dossier suggests competence, control, and a fierce dedication to professional boundaries. Yet you looked at me. You violated the primary instruction. I apologize if my professionalism was misinterpreted, sir. Interpretation is irrelevant. Obedience is absolute. But defiance, when framed with such exquisite honesty, can sometimes be preferable. He leaned closer, the scent of him, not cologne, but something elemental, like stone and winter air, filling her lungs. The gravity of his presence was so immense that she felt pinned, unable to pull away, unable to resist the silent, overwhelming narrative he was dictating. The contract is simple, Elena. What I take, I own. What I own, I protect. You are now part of this house's internal structure. You belong to the silence. He didn't wait for her consent. He didn't need it. The ensuing intimacy was a maelstrom of psychological depth, an intellectual collision masquerading as physical proximity. It was a terrifying merging of wills, a silent exchange of power where Elena's fierce control was systematically dismantled, layer by agonizing layer, by the sheer, relentless focus of his mind. The experience was one of total surrender, not to a man, but to an overwhelming force of nature. It was the deepest, most dangerous secret she had ever kept, a silent scream swallowed by the heavy air of the estate. Nikolai was meticulous, deliberate, and entirely centered on the psychological threshold of her endurance, pushing her past fear into a territory of dangerous, magnetic vulnerability. When it was over, abruptly with the same startling efficiency with which it began, Nikolai rose. He did not look back. He simply became a silhouette in the doorway again, gathering the shadows around him like a cloak. The children's stability rests on your silence, Elena, he stated, his voice back to its usual low, commanding resonance. Do not confuse what happened here with softness. It was a test and a necessary alignment. Then he was gone, leaving behind not warmth, but a residue of charged, glacial tension. The dawn arrived, grey and unforgiving. Elena did not sleep. She lay there, rigid, analyzing the devastation. It was not her body that was wounded, but her carefully constructed reality. She had been warned of the emotional danger, yet she hadn't understood the magnitude of Nikolai's ability to find and exploit the deep, silent hunger for connection she thought she had mastered. She dressed in the same sensible, muted clothing, her movements precise and automatic. She found Zina waiting in the hallway outside the children's wing at 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes ahead of schedule. Zina's silver eyes swept over Elena with an unnerving, clinical assessment. Elena braced herself, certain the older woman could read the invisible scar left by the night. You look pale, Elena, Zina observed, her voice flat. Did you sleep poorly? The house takes some getting used to, Elena replied, maintaining steady eye contact, a deliberate refusal to flinch. It is very quiet. Quiet is a privilege here. Treat it as such. Zina sniffed, apparently satisfied by Elena's composure, though the observation had unnerved her. The morning routine was a brittle exercise in normalcy. Victor was already awake, sitting cross-legged on his reading rug, devouring a textbook on astrophysics. Darya, still shy, was coloring furiously, the paper covered in violent shades of red and black. Elena engaged them, determined to fulfill her original contract, to stabilize the atmosphere. Victor, I noticed you finished the entire volume on planetary motion. Shall we discuss the gravitational effects of a binary star system? Victor's intense gaze lifted from the page, surprise flickering across his face. You know about binary systems? I know enough to appreciate the mathematical elegance of two massive objects locked in an eternal destructive dance, Elena responded, the metaphor hitting too close to home. A connection clicked between them, a shared intellectual space that momentarily lowered Victor's guard. Darya, sensing the shift, looked up. Read to me, Elena. Daria commanded softly, holding up her worn copy of The Snow Queen. Elena sat between them, the warmth of their small, contained world a temporary shield against the glacial atmosphere of the estate. She read about the shards of the troll mirror lodging in hearts and eyes, making everything beautiful seem ugly, and everything kind seem cruel. The irony was suffocating. They were having breakfast in the children's sunny, private dining alcove when the pressure drop occurred again. Nikolai entered the main dining hall, visible through the arched doorway. He was dressed in a dark suit, immaculate and intimidating, already engaged in a low, intense conversation with a man Elena recognized as one of his principal security officers, a silent monolith named Yevgeny. Elena instinctively stiffened, the spoon freezing halfway to her mouth. She felt the electric pull, the invisible line still taut between them. She knew, without looking directly at him, that his attention was momentarily fixed on their alcove. Victor, keenly aware of his father's movements, grew rigid. Daria immediately dropped her gaze to her plate, her small shoulders hunching. This was the first real obstacle. The emotional fallout of the night was now directly impacting her duties. Elena had to break the spell. She leaned toward Victor, deliberately ignoring the monumental presence in the next room. "Victor, tell me, if the mass of the star A were doubled, how would that affect the orbital period of star B?" The intellectual challenge anchored Victor. He paused, frowning in concentration, and began to calculate aloud. Daria, sensing Elena's focus remained on them, slowly relaxed her posture. Elena maintained a calm, steady rhythm, creating a zone of safety that Nikolai's gravity could not penetrate. She risked a single, instantaneous glance toward Nikolai. He was still talking to Yevgeny, but his eyes were on her. There was no expression of warmth or gratitude for her stabilization of the children. There was only pure, cold assessment, a calculation of her utility. It confirmed her fear. She was a highly specialized tool, and last night was merely the calibration. The intensity of the look was a silent command. You perform your role, you maintain the facade, or the stability is fractured, and the consequences are immediate. Later that afternoon, Elena found herself restless. The confinement felt tighter, the air heavier. She needed to introduce some semblance of normalcy for the children, something that pushed against the absolute isolation. She found Zina supervising the laundry staff in the sterile basement. "Zina," Elena said, her voice measured. "I've observed that Daria is struggling with expressive language, and Victor is suffering from lack of peer interaction. I believe a short, supervised walk in the immediate vicinity of the estate grounds, within the perimeter fence, would be beneficial for their psychological health." Zina stopped folding a massive white sheet. Her eyes narrowed, the disapproval immediate and chilling. "Mr. Volkov's instructions are explicit, Elena. The children do not leave the house without his direct written permission, which is rarely granted. Their safety is paramount. Physical safety, yes, but psychological health is also safety, Zina. They are becoming withdrawn. Their father requires discipline, not freedom. Your job is to facilitate his requirements, not challenge them." Zina leaned in, her voice dropping to that familiar, terrifying hush. "You forget your place quickly, Elena. You are a paid service, not a consultant on the Volkov family's operational methods." The confrontation was a necessary friction. Elena had established the first boundary, drawing a small, faint line in the sand regarding the children's welfare. That evening, after dinner, she was summoned. Not by Zina, but by Yevgeny, who simply stood outside her door and nodded toward the long corridor. Nikolai was in his study, a massive room dominated by dark wood, leather, and a wall of monitors displaying the estate's security feeds. He was seated behind a vast, empty desk. The only light came from the screens and a single, low-hanging lamp. Elena stood before the desk, waiting. The air was charged, expectant. Nikolai steepled his fingers, his gaze unreadable. Zena informs me you attempted to alter the established protocol regarding my children's movement. I made a professional recommendation based on my observations of their well-being, sir. Your recommendations are noted, Elena. But they are irrelevant. The perimeter exists for a reason that supersedes your psychological theories. He paused, leaning back slightly, studying her with an intensity that felt like a physical probe. Do you understand the difference between risk and certainty? I believe so, sir. Risk is the chance you took last night by looking at me. Certainty is the outcome of that choice. He shifted forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous level of intimacy. You have established a profound connection with the children, quickly. This is valuable. It also makes you incredibly vulnerable. Elena felt a cold knot form in her stomach. I do not understand, sir. Your attachment is now a lever, Elena. If you attempt to manipulate the structure of this house, if you challenge Zena or myself regarding the rules, I will not punish you. I will remove the children's stability. I will make their lives here unbearable until they beg for your absence. The threat was perfectly calibrated. It wasn't about her job or her life. It was about the two fragile beings she had vowed to protect. The true danger of the house was not the armed guards or the secrets, but the deep, emotional hostages she had unknowingly given. You have placed yourself in my debt, Elena, Nikolai concluded, his voice smooth as ice. The emotional price of your defiance is not your own to pay. It is theirs. He lifted his hand in a gesture of dismissal, ending the audience. Elena left the study, her steps heavy. The psychological contract had been violently rewritten. She was not just a nanny. She was a variable in Nikolai's complex equation of control, and her newly established, terrifying connection with him was the precise mechanism by which he would ensure her absolute compliance. She retreated to her room, the need for solitude overwhelming. She needed to process the new, devastating parameters of her existence. She was trapped, not by physical bars, but by the thread of her own compassion. She sat on the edge of her bed, the moon casting long, spectral shadows across the rug. A low, insistent knock came at the door, soft enough to be missed, yet loud enough to demand attention. Elena froze. It was too early for Zena. It was too loud for Nikolai. She walked slowly to the door and hesitated. She knew opening it meant accepting the next wave of collision. She pulled the heavy wood inward, just enough to see who stood there. It wasn't Nikolai. It was Daria. The little girl stood rigid in a thick white flannel nightgown, her small face pale and wide-eyed in the dim light. She held a single, small, crumpled piece of paper in her hand. Elena, Daria whispered, her voice trembling. I heard the man talking to Papa in the hall. He used your name. I think he took something that belongs to you. Daria thrust the paper into Elena's hand. It was a photograph, small and slightly water-damaged. A picture Elena had kept hidden at the bottom of her suitcase. A smiling, vibrant photograph of her elderly mother, taken shortly before Elena left home. Elena's blood ran cold. The man Daria heard was Yevgeny, Nikolai's security chief. They hadn't just threatened her life or her job. They had breached the final, most sacred boundary. The photograph was not a warning. It was a declaration of war on her past, a confirmation that Nikolai Volkov now held every piece of her external life in his hand. The emotional risk had just metastasized into absolute, tangible threat. The photograph felt like a shard of ice in Elena's palm, cold and brittle. It was not a physical weapon, but a perfect, precise strike against the one vulnerability she thought she had shielded. Her past. Daria stood frozen, watching her with the terrified expectation of a small animal observing a predator. Elena instantly crushed the surge of panic. She knelt, bringing herself level with Daria, forcing a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Daria. This is mine. Where did you find it?" "In the hall," Daria whispered, clutching her flannel nightgown. "Near the big man, Yevgeny. He dropped it when Papa called him away. He was holding a stack of papers." "You are very brave to bring it to me," Elena said, tucking the photo deep into the pocket of her sensible robe. "But you must not tell anyone you saw this, Daria. Not even Victor. This is our secret. Can you promise me?" Daria nodded solemnly, her eyes wide with the importance of the pact. "I promise. Does the bad man have your mama?" Elena pulled the child into a swift, fierce hug, desperate to convey a safety she no longer felt. "No, darling. My mother is safe. We will keep her safe by being very, very careful, yes? Now back to bed. It is freezing out here." Daria retreated, a small, white shadow disappearing back toward the children's wing. Elena remained kneeling for a long moment, the silence of the corridor suffocating her. The threat was no longer theoretical. Nikolai Volkov had not just taken a hostage. He had reached outside the granite walls of his fortress and inserted himself into the most intimate corner of her life. He had access to everything. The discovery shifted Elena's entire internal architecture. Her compliance was now absolute, but her quiet rebellion transformed from a matter of self-preservation to a mission of espionage. She had to learn the scope of the threat, why she was really here, and what Nikolai was truly protecting. The next few days settled into a tense, dangerous rhythm. Elena performed her duties flawlessly. She engaged Victor in complex mathematical debates, offering the intellectual challenge the boy craved. She provided Daria with the stability and soft attention that slowly began to thaw the child's deep-seated fear. She was the perfect, capable nanny, a structure of calm in a chaotic environment. But beneath the surface, Elena was watching, recording, and analyzing. She noticed the security patterns, the 3 distinct, overlapping shifts of Yevgeny's men. She noted Nikolai's schedule, his departure at 8 a.m., his return usually after 10 p.m., punctuated by erratic midday appearances that always caused a palpable tremor of stress throughout the house. Most importantly, she observed Nikolai himself. He was a force of nature, cold, demanding, yet his focus on the children, though distant, was absolute. He wasn't indifferent. He was meticulously controlling their environment. The first breakthrough came not through observation, but through pure, obsessive curiosity. Elena was in the main library, a cavernous space filled with leather-bound volumes that looked more decorative than read. Victor had asked for a book on Baroque architecture, and Elena used the opportunity to explore. She found a section marked Private Archives, tucked behind a sliding wall of false books. Zina had warned her that the library was off-limits outside of supervised reading with the children. The risk was enormous, but the need for information was greater. She waited until the late afternoon, during Daria's structured nap time, a period when Zina was occupied with household accounts. The house was silent, wrapped in the predictable, suffocating quiet. Using a fine needle borrowed from the sewing kit, Elena picked the simple lock on the archive door, a skill acquired during her high-stress youth in a difficult neighborhood, long before the master's degree. The archive was a small, climate-controlled room. It wasn't filled with ledgers of illicit deals, but files dedicated solely to the children. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, the sound deafening in the silence. She scanned the files quickly. Birth certificates, medical records, educational assessments, all pristine. Then she found the file labeled Ekaterina Volkov, deceased. Ekaterina was the children's mother, Nikolai's wife. Elena braced herself, pulling the file open. The death certificate was stark, 5 years prior, cause of death, accident. But beneath the death certificate, There was a stack of highly sensitive police reports, heavily redacted, dating back 6 years. Elena focused on the few unredacted details. The reports detailed a brutal, targeted attack on a property owned by the Volkov family in St. Petersburg. The target was Ekaterina. It was not a robbery. It was professional, explosive, and failed only because Ekaterina was in a different part of the house. The second successful attack, listed as the accident, was described in the police reports as a complex vehicular sabotage executed with military precision. The reports led Elena to a single, terrifying conclusion. Nikolai Volkov was not just a powerful man. He was a man at war. And Ekaterina had been a casualty of that war. There was a final thin envelope at the bottom of the file. Inside was a series of encrypted messages and photographs. The photos were grainy, surveillance shots of 2 different men, scarred and expressionless. The accompanying text, partially decoded, mentioned the vultures and the debt. Elena understood then why the estate was a fortress, why the children were isolated, and why the threat of erasure was so casually delivered. The world outside was not just morally corrupt. It was actively trying to kill the Volkov line. Nikolai wasn't isolating his children out of cruelty. He was burying them alive to keep them safe from the men who murdered their mother. The certainty of Nikolai's absolute villainy fractured. He was still ruthless, still controlling, but his actions were driven by a terrifying, desperate paternal instinct. He was not just the predator, he was the shepherd protecting his flock from wolves. Elena heard the faint click of the archive door locking from the outside. She froze, the blood draining from her face. She hadn't locked it behind herself. A figure stood silhouetted against the dim light of the library, filling the small doorway. Nikolai. "You are faster than I anticipated, Elena." His voice was dangerously soft, a sound that implied imminent violence. He didn't move toward her. He simply leaned against the doorframe, ensuring there was no escape. Elena forced herself to stand, placing the file back on the desk slowly, deliberately. She did not flinch. She met his gaze, the steel of his eyes now burning with a cold, contained fury. "I was searching for a book on architecture for Victor," she lied, the words tasting like ash. Nikolai's dark smile was devoid of humor. "Do you often search for Baroque architecture among the casualty reports of the St. Petersburg police, Elena?" The pretense was over. He knew everything. The tension in the small room was so intense, it felt like the air itself was tearing. "I found the file," Elena admitted, her voice steady despite the seismic shift of her internal world. "I saw the reports on Ekaterina Volkov." "And what did you conclude?" He challenged, taking a slow step into the room, his presence immediately swallowing the remaining space. "I concluded that the discretion you demand is not about protecting your reputation, but protecting the lives of your children from an external active threat, and that the isolation is the cost of their survival." Nikolai stopped barely 2 feet away from her. The proximity was a punishment, the silent gravity pulling her toward another, inevitable collision. "You have an unfortunate habit of finding the truth, Elena. And the truth in this house is a liability. You looked for answers when you were instructed to maintain the silence." "My mother's photograph was stolen from my private belongings, Mr. Volkov. I am now collateral in your war. I have the right to know the parameters of the danger." The mention of her mother sharpened the air between them. Nikolai's eyes narrowed, acknowledging the validity of her defiance. "Your mother is a complication managed by Yevgeny," Nikolai stated, his tone flat. "A necessary insurance policy to ensure your absolute focus. You will adhere to the contract. The danger is absolute. It is a constant force that seeks to dismantle everything I have built." Elena felt a dangerous, reckless courage surge through her, fueled by the realization that she was fighting not just for herself, but for her mother, and perhaps, indirectly, for the children. If the danger is absolute, Mr. Volkov, then the children need more than just silence and granite walls. They need resilience. They need to understand the world they are being protected from, or they will be defenseless when they eventually encounter it. Nikolai stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had expected fear, perhaps tears, certainly a plea for her own safety. He had not expected a strategic counter-argument based on the welfare of his children. You are attempting to leverage your position, Elena. A mistake that will cost you everything. I am attempting to fulfill my contract with complete honesty, she countered, refusing to back down, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm. I am here to stabilize them. I cannot stabilize them by keeping them ignorant of the reality of their heritage. They are the children of a man who is at war. They need to be prepared. The atmosphere between them crackled. This was the true collision, a battle of wills and intellect. Nikolai was calculating the risk of her insight against the security of her silence. He reached out, his hand moving with deceptive slowness, settling on the curve of her neck, not gripping, but resting, a terrifying weight of controlled power. You are correct about one thing, Elena, he murmured, his voice low, intimate, and devastating. They are mine, and I will burn the world down to protect them. If your suggestions endanger that protection, you become the most immediate threat. He pulled her closer, the magnetic force overwhelming. Her body reacted before her mind could process the command, leaning into the danger. I saw the photographs, Nikolai, Elena whispered, using his first name for the first time, an act of intimate defiance. I saw the men. Who are the vultures? The shift in address was a deliberate provocation, tearing down the professional distance. Nikolai's gaze intensified, the glacier momentarily cracking to reveal a deep, cold fire. The vultures, he stated, his voice a low, lethal confession, are the ones who sent you here. They lost a great deal when Ekaterina was killed. They believe they are owed payment. They believe the children are the collateral. The world tilted. Elena's breath caught in her throat. They hired me? She asked, the realization a punch to the gut. Zena, the references, the contract, it was all a setup. Nikolai nodded once, a sharp, minimal movement. They infiltrated the network that supplied my domestic staff. They planted you. They hoped you would be the weakness, the flaw in the perimeter they could exploit. The shock was absolute. Elena was not a hostage. She was a Trojan horse, unknowingly carrying the danger inside the walls. Her entire history, her master's degree, her references, it was all a sophisticated, deadly lie constructed by his enemies. The contract you signed, Elena, Nikolai concluded, his thumb tracing the frantic pulse point in her neck, confirming his ownership of her fear. It was not mine. It was theirs. And now you have been activated. He released her, the sudden absence of his touch almost as destabilizing as his presence. He stepped back toward the door, his face once again an unreadable mask of ice and marble. You are no longer the nanny, Elena. You are the risk I have contained. The question is whether you choose to be the weapon they designed you to be, or the shield I require you to become. He opened the archive door, letting the library light flood in, momentarily blinding her. I am giving you 24 hours to decide your allegiance, he commanded. If you fail to choose correctly, the safety of your mother will be the least of your concerns. You will be erased, and the children will watch. Nikolai disappeared, leaving Elena trapped, not by a locked door, but by the devastating reality of her situation. She was deep behind enemy lines, and the enemy was no longer Nikolai Volkov, but the shadowy architects who had placed her there. Her identity, her past, and her future were all lies. The safety of everyone she cared about rested entirely on her ability to betray the people who had hired her, and fully submit to the dangerous gravity of the man who now held her life in his hands. The 24-hour clock had begun. The 24-hour clock was not a measure of time. It was the countdown to her execution, regardless of her choice. If Elena stayed silent, Nikolai would eliminate her as a threat. If she sided with the vultures, Nikolai would eliminate her and possibly her mother. There was only one path left. Total, unreserved commitment to Nikolai's side and immediate action to prove it. Hesitation was betrayal. Elena left her room and walked back through the silent, oppressive corridors toward Nikolai's study. The house was a labyrinth of shadows, but she moved with a purpose she hadn't possessed hours earlier. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a combatant claiming her ground. She found Yevgeny guarding the study door. The security chief, a man built like a granite slab, simply raised an eyebrow in silent question. "I need to speak to Mr. Volkov." "Now," Elena stated, her voice low and edged with absolute certainty. Yevgeny assessed her, noting the absence of fear, the presence of cold, calculated resolve. He nodded once, opened the door, and closed it silently behind her. Nikolai was exactly where she had left him, still seated behind the massive desk, the glow of the security monitors painting stark geometric patterns across his sharp features. He didn't look up immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, testing her nerve. "Your 24 hours have scarcely begun, Elena," he observed, his voice neutral. "The deadline is irrelevant, Mr. Volkov," she countered, walking toward the center of the room, stopping directly in front of the desk. "Waiting ensures I'm eliminated before I can deliver the necessary information. I have made my choice. I choose survival and the safety of the children." Nikolai finally lifted his head, his steel eyes locking onto hers. The gaze was an interrogation, cold and relentless. "Survival is not a choice. It is a consequence. What evidence do you offer that I should accept your allegiance?" "The vultures did not recruit me through a standard agency," Elena explained, speaking quickly and precisely, laying out the architecture of the deception. "They used my history of high-stress employment and my master's degree as a cover story, but my true activation was embedded in the technology I was required to use. My personal tablet, which Xena collected upon my arrival, contains a proprietary encryption key. If I activate it, it sends a beacon. A specific, encrypted signal that alerts my handler that I have infiltrated and am ready to receive instructions." Nikolai leaned forward slowly, the movement predatory. "And you believe this handler would risk approaching the estate based on a single signal?" "Yes. They believe the house's internal security is focused on physical entry points, not domestic staff. They believe I am invisible. The signal is designed to bring the handler to the secondary gate, the service entrance near the forest, tonight. Within the hour. They want a report immediately." The silence that followed was dense, absorbing all light and sound. Nikolai didn't move, but the sheer force of his concentrated thought was suffocating. He was weighing the risk of trusting the woman planted by his enemies against the opportunity to capture an immediate asset of those enemies. "This is a trap," Nikolai stated, not as a question, but a fact. "It is," Elena agreed. "The question is, whose trap?" A flicker of something, not trust, but perhaps respect for her cold logic, crossed Nikolai's face. "You understand that if this is a double cross, you will not survive the exposure. I understand that if I had wished to betray you, I would have waited 23 hours and 59 minutes to activate the signal, ensuring your security measures were less prepared. I am offering you the immediate capture of an operative, Mr. Volkov. I am offering you proof." Nikolai picked up a sleek black phone from his desk and pressed a button. "Yevgeny, immediate briefing in the armory. Bring 4 men. Priority Delta, now." He hung up, his eyes never leaving Alina's. "You will come with me. You will execute the activation sequence precisely as you were instructed. If you deviate by a single breath, Yevgeny will end this immediately." Alina nodded. The alliance was forged in the cold calculus of mutual necessity. They were bound, not by affection, but by the gravitational pull of shared, immediate danger. The armory was located deep beneath the main house, a space of polished steel and hushed, lethal efficiency. The air smelled of cleaning oil and anticipation. Nikolai changed out of his suit into tactical black clothing that somehow made him look even more imposing. Alina stood near the entrance, acutely aware of the armed men surrounding her. They were preparing for war, and she was the fuse. "Describe the handler," Nikolai commanded, clipping a suppressor onto a rifle. "I have never met him physically," Alina admitted. "My contact was entirely encrypted. But based on the file I saw, they would send someone professional. Likely a man named Arkady, one of the men in the surveillance photos labeled the Vulture's debt collectors." Yevgeny laid out a schematic of the estate on a metal table. "The secondary gate is heavily reinforced. If he approaches on foot, we have a clear line of sight." "He will not approach on foot," Alina interjected, leaning over the table, her professionalism taking over. "The Vultures specialize in vehicular sabotage. They will use a drop-off point, a quick exchange. They won't linger. I am the asset. They won't risk me in a firefight." Nikolai looked at her, his assessment quick and absolute. "She is correct. Yevgeny, set up the perimeter 300 meters from the gate. 2 men on the ridge, 2 flanking the service road. No engagement until I give the order." He turned to Alina, handing her the encrypted tablet. "The activation." Alina took the device. Her hands were steady. She went through the motions, the complex tap sequence, the specific delay, the final confirmation that sent the silent, coded message out into the freezing night. The magnetic pull between her and Nikolai intensified to an unbearable degree, the shared secret making the space between them volatile. "It is done," Alina said, handing the tablet back. "He will arrive in 30 minutes. 30 minutes to prove your life is worth sparing," Nikolai murmured. They moved quickly to a secure observation room overlooking the service gate. It was completely dark, the only light provided by the infrared monitors showing the snow-covered landscape in stark black and white. Nikolai positioned himself at the window, his form a silent, immovable presence. Alina stood slightly behind him, watching the monitor with the cold focus of a scientist observing an experiment. The tension was suffocating. Every ticking second was a palpable weight. "You are remarkably calm for a woman who has just guaranteed either the capture of her recruiters or her own death," Nikolai noted, his voice a low vibration in the darkness. "I have accepted the consequences of my choices," Alina replied. "The true danger in this house, Nikolai, is not physical. It is the overwhelming gravity of your expectations. Once I accepted that gravity, the rest became simple mechanics." He turned his head slightly, acknowledging the profound intimacy of her observation. The use of his first name was no longer defiance. It was the language of their new, dangerous partnership. "And what do you expect of me, Alina?" "I expect you to protect my mother, just as you protect Daria and Victor," she stated. "I expect you to acknowledge that I am no longer a tool of your enemy, but a necessary stabilizer within your perimeter." He didn't answer with words. He reached out and placed his hand on the small of her back. It was not a comforting gesture, but a proprietary one, a confirmation of ownership in the face of imminent risk. The contact was a jolt, an electrical current that bound them together in the darkness, replacing the need for verbal confirmation. A faint movement registered on the infrared monitor. A dark vehicle, lights off, crept along the service road, stopping just outside the perimeter fence. The timing was exact. "Target acquired," Yevgeny's voice crackled over the secure comms. "Two individuals. Driver remains in the vehicle. The second is exiting." Nikolai's grip on Elena's back tightened, a silent command for absolute stillness. The figure exiting the car was tall, moving with the trained economy of a professional. He carried a small satchel. This was Arkady. "Elena, Ims." Nikolai's voice was a low whisper next to her ear, charged with immense, contained power. "You will go to the gate. You will open the pedestrian access. You will take the satchel. You will tell him the children are restless and that the internal structure is weak. Do not, under any circumstances, allow him to cross the threshold." "Understood." She moved toward the internal door, her heart hammering not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the mission. She was walking into the mouth of the wolf, but she was armed with knowledge. Nikolai stopped her with a light touch on her arm. He looked down at her, the intensity in his eyes overwhelming. "If he makes any move toward you, Elena, you drop to the ground. Yevgeny will not hesitate." "And you?" she challenged, meeting his gaze. "I will watch, and I will confirm that your survival is now intrinsically linked to mine." The statement was the most profound declaration of commitment he could offer. Elena walked out into the sub-zero night, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. She approached the massive iron gate, the snow crunching loudly beneath her boots. Arkady stood on the other side, a silent, menacing shadow. Elena used the internal access code to release the small pedestrian door, allowing it to swing inward just enough for the exchange. "Elena Petrova," Arkady's voice was rough, low. "You took your time. The internal structure. Report." "It's weak," Elena lied smoothly, her voice betraying no tremor. "The children are the key. They are unstable, anxious. Volkov is focused on external threats. He relies on Zina for internal maintenance, and she is predictable." Arkady nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness behind her, assessing the risk. He pushed the satchel through the gap in the gate. "The tablet. Did you bring the tablet?" "I destroyed it," Elena said, "a calculated risk. Too much risk of surveillance. The data is compromised." Arkady's face tightened with annoyance. "Amateur. Inside the satchel is a new comms device and your next instruction. You are to plant a vulnerability in the main server room by midnight tomorrow. We will exploit the resulting gap." "I understand." Elena reached for the satchel, her fingers brushing against the cold leather. Suddenly Arkady lunged, his hand shooting through the gap, not reaching for the satchel, but seizing Elena's wrist with brutal speed. "Wait," he hissed, his eyes narrowing, looking past her shoulder. "You move too calmly. You are not frightened enough, Elena. Volkov must be nearby." Elena's mind raced. The collision was happening now. She had to break the contact and trigger the response. "I am not frightened of you, Arkady," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. He pulled her wrist hard, attempting to drag her through the narrow opening. The pain was immediate and sharp. This was the moment of absolute risk. "Yevgeny, now!" Nikolai's voice erupted, not over the comms, but physically, thundering from the observation booth above. The world exploded in sound, a flash of light from the ridge, followed by the deep thwack of a silenced round. Arkady gasped, his grip immediately slackening. He staggered back, looking down at the dark stain blooming across his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elena dropped to the snow, covering her head as Nikolai's men, Yevgeny leading them, swarmed the gate. Arkady collapsed, his body falling backward onto the frozen ground outside the perimeter. The driver immediately slammed the car into reverse, tires spitting snow, fleeing the scene. Yevgeny secured the area, calling in the status. Elena remained kneeling in the snow, the adrenaline receding, leaving her shaking violently. She was alive. She was safe. She had chosen. A moment later, Nikolai was there. He moved with impossible speed, pulling her up from the ground. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He simply hauled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with a fierce, possessive strength that felt less like comfort and more like a claim. The cold air was shattered by the immense, silent relief that radiated from him. "You held," he murmured into her hair, the vibration of his voice resonating through her skull. "You did not break. The children are safe," Elena stated, focusing on the only certainty left. "Because of your immediate, absolute loyalty," Nikolai confirmed. He pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face, his gaze searching hers in the dim light. The assessment was over. The conclusion was drawn. He picked up the satchel that had fallen into the snow. "You risked everything for this exchange." They returned to the quiet, secure warmth of the study, leaving Yevgeny and his men to manage the fallout at the gate. Nikolai tossed the satchel onto the desk. "Open it. Tell me what they intended." Elena opened the satchel. Inside was a high-tech comms device, fully encrypted. Beneath it was a folded paper with typewritten instructions. "Vulnerability, primary server access code. Use the standard psychological profile override key. The key is in the child." Elena frowned, reading the words again. "The key is in the child. What does that mean?" Nikolai stood over her, his eyes scanning the note. He picked up the new comms device and smashed it against the edge of the desk. "It means your handlers are far more sophisticated than simple assassins, Elena. They knew you were planted to establish trust with the children. They planned to use your psychological access to exploit their vulnerability. But the primary server access code, why would that be linked to one of the children?" Elena asked, feeling a renewed wave of dread. Nikolai's jaw tightened. He walked to a locked wall panel behind his desk, inputting a complex sequence. The panel slid open, revealing not a safe, but a small, highly secured data drive. "The primary server controls everything: finance, communications, and the estate's physical defenses," Nikolai explained, his voice grim. "The access key is not a word. It is a sequence of highly personal memories. My operational key is derived from the 5 most profound emotional anchors in my life. The final anchor is Victor's birth date, combined with the name of his favorite toy, which I gave him the day he was born." Elena stared at the data drive, realizing the horrific implication. "The vultures didn't want me to plant a virus. They wanted me to extract the final key from Victor by gaining his absolute trust. They planned to use the psychological profile override, my expertise, to break the child's emotional defenses and extract the final piece of the code." She looked at Nikolai, repulsion warring with a new, terrifying understanding of his paranoia. "They planned to betray me too. They would have used the information and eliminated me as a witness." "Of course," Nikolai stated, his tone flat. "In this war, you are either a weapon or a target. You just proved you are not their weapon." He stepped closer to her, the magnetic field between them now charged with the terrifying potential of their shared knowledge. "The alliance is sealed, Elena. You are mine now. You are part of the structure. But the threat remains. Arkady was only the messenger. The vultures know I have stabilized the perimeter, but they also know the weakness they exploited to get you here." Elena lifted her head, meeting his intense gaze. "The weakness is my past. The fact that I was desperate enough to take the job." "No," Nikolai corrected, his hand tracing the curve of her throat again, the gesture possessive and deeply unsettling. "The weakness is the vulnerability they used to construct your background, your fierce, misplaced loyalty to the people you love. They did not just track your mother, Elena. They tracked you long before this contract. They know your true, unspoken name." Elena froze. "My true name? I don't understand." "They know you are not Elena Petrova." Nikolai leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that carried the weight of the deepest, most shattering secret in the house. They know you are Anya Volkov's sister. The revelation was a physical blow, stealing her breath entirely. Anya. Her sister, who had disappeared 10 years ago, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a gaping wound in Alina's life. Anya was not just a name in a file. She was my wife's closest confidant. Nikolai continued, his voice devoid of emotion. She was the link between my world and the world I tried to keep Ekaterina in. She vanished when the war began. The vultures did not hire Elena Petrova, the psychologist. They hired the sibling, hoping to exploit the emotional debt I owe to Anya's memory. They planted you, hoping the gravitational pull of your family history would force a collision that would destroy my defenses. Elena stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The entire narrative of her life was a lie. A sophisticated construction built by Nikolai's enemies to penetrate his fortress through the one connection he couldn't sever. Family legacy. She was not just a nanny. She was a ghost from his past, unknowingly placed in the heart of his present danger. Nikolai, seeing the devastation in her eyes, closed the distance between them, his presence overwhelming. You are now fully exposed, Elena. Not just to me, but to them. They know I have you. They know your true identity, and they will use the one thing you care about most, your sister, to ensure you choose their side. He didn't touch her, but the collision of their minds was absolute. She saw the truth reflected in his glacial gaze. Her sister, Anya, was likely not dead, but a captive, held by the vultures as the ultimate leverage. The tension in the room reached its breaking point. Elena had chosen allegiance, but the price of that allegiance had just multiplied 1,000-fold. "What do I do?" she finally managed, her voice a brittle whisper. Nikolai's face was hard, unyielding, yet beneath the ice, a desperate strategy was forming. "You maintain the illusion, Elena," he commanded, his eyes burning with cold fire. "You are a master of psychological control. You will stabilize the children. You will use your position to understand their vulnerabilities. And together, we will turn this house from a fortress into a trap. Because now, we hunt the vultures for the sake of your sister, and for the safety of my children. And if we fail, everything burns." He reached out, his hand settling on her shoulder, a heavy, silent vow. The vultures will not wait. They will strike at the house's perimeter again, and they will use the children as their primary leverage. You are the only person who can stop them, Elena. You are the only person they trust inside these walls, and you are the only one I trust to fight this war with me. The climax had arrived. The boundaries between employer and employee, between professional and lover, between enemy and ally, were entirely dissolved. They were two massive objects locked in an eternal destructive dance, and the fate of everyone they cared about depended on the perfect, terrifying synchronization of their movements. The next move would determine whether the house became a sanctuary or a tomb. The decision was not a choice, but an irreversible shift in mass. Elena had crossed the gravitational line, and the only path forward was absolute synchronization with Nikolai Volkov. The knowledge of her true identity, Anya's sister, had simultaneously weaponized and stabilized her. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a deliberate piece on Nikolai's chessboard. Nikolai did not waste a moment on contemplation. The moment Elena finished speaking, he was in motion, his mind calculating variables faster than any computer. The vultures will assume Arkadi's failure was due to immediate perimeter security, not internal compromise, Nikolai stated, pacing the dark study. They will escalate. They will target the weakness Arkady was meant to exploit, the children's routine. Alina gripped the satchel instruction sheet, the paper crinkling in her hand. They know the key is in Victor's routine. They will likely try to force him into a high-stress scenario, hoping to trigger the memory sequence. Exactly. They will aim for chaos, forcing me to choose between the perimeter and the inner sanctum. Nikolai stopped, his eyes fixed on Alina. You are the bait, Alina, and you are the shield. We use the vulnerability they built into you to dismantle their operation. The plan was brutal, relying entirely on Alina's ability to maintain a psychological barrier under fire. They would simulate the children's normal 9 a.m. study period in Victor's room, located in the most exposed wing of the house, drawing the vultures to the perceived weakness. The security staff, led by Yevgeny, were deployed with surgical precision, utilizing Alina's knowledge of the vulture's infiltration strategy. Yevgeny was skeptical, his granite face confirming his suspicion of the woman who had only hours ago been his enemy's asset. But he obeyed Nikolai without question. Alina spent the remaining dark hours with Victor and Daria. She did not explain the danger. Instead, she reinforced their sense of safety through structure, focusing their attention on a complex physics puzzle and Daria's elaborate drawing of a safe, imaginary castle. As the gray dawn broke, the atmosphere was thick, not with silence, but with a humming, latent power. Nikolai was stationed in the reinforced observation room, directly above Victor's wing. At precisely 8:55 a.m., Alina was seated with Victor and Daria at a large table by the expansive window of the study room. The room was bright, exposed, and entirely intentional. Victor, Alina said calmly, placing a timer on the table. We have 5 minutes to solve the paradox of the unobserved quantum particle. Focus, Daria. Draw me the deepest, safest part of your castle. The children, sensing the unusual, absolute stillness in Alina's demeanor, responded with intense concentration. They were anchors in the storm, unaware they were the center of the collision. At 9:02 a.m., the estate violently fractured. It began not with a shot, but with a massive, targeted explosion at the primary generator, plunging the house into immediate, absolute darkness. The emergency lights flickered on a second later, bathing the room in a sickly, cold red. Victor gasped, dropping his pencil. Daria let out a small, terrified whimper. Focus, Alina commanded, her voice cutting through the panic, steady and unwavering. It is only sound. The walls are strong. Victor, the paradox. What happens when the observer is removed? She did not flinch, did not look toward the window, where the security chaos was unfolding. Her entire focus was a gravitational field centered on the children, forcing their reality back into the structured safety of the puzzle. The sounds of heavy combat began almost immediately. Distant automatic fire, shattered glass from the lower levels. The vultures were not subtle. They were overwhelming the perimeter, forcing Nikolai to commit his limited inner resources. A minute later, the inner alarms screamed, signaling a breach. Alina knew they were close. She could feel the pressure wave of the intrusion, the same electrical spike that accompanied Nikolai's presence, but this time it was laced with malice. A man burst through the reinforced door, not Arkady, but one of the other men from the surveillance file, a tall, heavily built operative with a scarred face, moving with ruthless speed. He ignored Victor and Daria, his eyes snapping immediately to Alina. He was holding a large, encrypted comms device. "Anya's sister!" the man hissed, his voice rough with triumph. "The game is over. Where is the key?" Alina stood slowly, placing herself between the scarred man and the children. Victor and Daria were frozen, their eyes wide, but they remained seated, held in place by Alina's psychological leash. "The key is irrelevant," Alina stated, projecting absolute calm. "Your operation is compromised. Nikolai is waiting. Nikolai is downstairs dealing with the diversion." The man sneered, taking a step closer. "We came for the collateral. And we came for you. Your sister is waiting for you to complete your mission, Elena. Fail her, and she pays the debt." The emotional threat was sharp, precise. It was designed to shatter Elena's carefully constructed composure. "Anya is not your collateral," Elena countered, her voice dropping to a dangerous low pitch. "She is your weakness. You kept her alive to control me. That leverage is gone. I have chosen my allegiance." The man hesitated, confusion flickering in his eyes. He raised the comms device, preparing to strike Elena. "You chose death, then," he spat. Before he could move, a voice cut through the tense air, cold and deadly, resonating from the open doorway behind him. "She chose my protection." Nikolai Volkov stood framed in the doorway, appearing as if he had materialized from the shadows. He was dressed in tactical gear, a rifle held casually, yet lethally, aimed. He had moved with impossible speed through the chaos, leaving Yevgeny to manage the perimeter breach. He was focused solely on the internal threat. The scarred operative spun, recognizing the lethal geometry of the situation. He raised the comms device, perhaps intending to use it as a makeshift weapon, or to signal a final, desperate command. The shot was immediate and clean. Not from Nikolai's rifle, but a single, sharp crack from a silenced pistol held by Zina, who had appeared silently beside Nikolai, her silver hair severe, her expression of permanent disappointment, now focused on the fallen man. The operative crumpled. Zina lowered the pistol, her gaze sweeping over the scene with clinical efficiency. "The children were nearly disturbed, Mr. Volkov," Zina stated, her voice dry as old parchment. "Unacceptable." Nikolai didn't acknowledge Zina. His eyes were locked on Elena, who stood rigidly over the children. The synchronization was perfect. Elena had held the emotional line until the external threat was neutralized. "It is over," Nikolai commanded, his voice returning to its normal, resonant depth. The violence subsided as quickly as it had begun. Yevgeny reported over the comms that the remaining vultures had retreated. The house, though scarred by bullet holes and shattered glass, began its slow, painful return to silence. Hours later, the sun had set, and the estate was once again sealed, the breaches repaired, the staff working with hushed, efficient movements to erase the evidence of the collision. Elena was alone in her room, the adrenaline crash leaving her weak. There was a faint bruise on her wrist where Arkady had grabbed her, a tangible reminder of the morning's violence. A soft knock came at her door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She knew the unique pressure wave of his arrival. Nikolai stood in the doorway, no longer in tactical gear, but dressed in dark, tailored silk, a man returning to his throne. The air around him was still charged, but the intensity of the war had been replaced by the heavy weight of consequence. "The vultures are neutralized," Nikolai stated, stepping into the room. "Their assets were compromised, their leadership is exposed, the threat to the children is stabilized." He paused, walking closer to her until the distance between them was measured in inches. The gravity was immense, pulling her into his orbit. "And your sister, Anya." Elena's heart seized. Is she alive?" "Yes," Nikolai confirmed, his eyes holding hers. "She was located in a holding facility in Kyiv. She is safe. She will be brought here under maximum security protocols. She will require time and discretion." Elena felt a sudden, overwhelming release of tension. She swayed, placing a hand on the wall for balance. The emotional debt was paid. Her choice had been validated. "You have earned your position here, Elena," Nikolai continued, his voice low. "You proved your allegiance under absolute pressure. The contract is rewritten." He reached out, his hand settling on the delicate curve of her neck, the same proprietary touch he had used in the study, but this time It carried the weight of a shared, bloody victory. You are no longer the nanny, Elena Petrova. You are the structural integrity of this house. You are the one who understands the mind of the predator and the mind of the prey. You will continue to stabilize the children. You will manage Anya's recovery, and you will remain here, within my perimeter. As what, Nikolai? She whispered, the question hanging heavy in the charged air. As a prisoner, a shield. As my necessary gravity, he corrected, his thumb tracing the line beneath her ear. You are the chaos I require to maintain control, the variable I cannot predict, yet the only one I trust to remain true to the core mission, the protection of the Volkov line. He leaned closer, his scent of cold night and expensive leather enveloping her. The collision between us was inevitable, Elena. We are two forces that cannot exist without affecting the other's orbit. Last night you chose to synchronize your orbit with mine. That choice is permanent. He did not apologize for the deception, the violence, or the fear. That was not his nature. The intimacy between them was not built on trust or softness, but on the terrifying, absolute knowledge of each other's vulnerabilities and capabilities. He lowered his head, and the kiss was not a gentle inquiry, but a consuming affirmation of ownership, cold and demanding, sealing their shared future in silence and secrecy. It was a silent vow that the war was over, but the dangerous dance had just begun. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were glacial, yet held a dangerous, contained fire that had not been there before the collision. The house is quiet, Elena, Nikolai murmured, his voice a promise and a threat. Ensure that the children believe in the quiet, but never confuse it with peace. He turned, leaving her standing alone in the silent room. She was trapped, yes, but she was also essential. She was no longer Elena Petrova, the deceived psychologist. She was the one woman who knew the deepest secrets of Nikolai Volkov, and she was the anchor holding his fragile, dangerous world together. Elena walked to the window, staring out at the floodlit, snow-covered grounds. The fortress stood firm. She had survived the storm, and in doing so, had become intrinsic to the architecture of the danger. The silence returned, but now it was a silence they shared, a profound, heavy, and absolutely magnetic quiet that would bind them until the next inevitable collision. She had traded her freedom for survival, and found in the heart of the darkness a terrifying, absolute purpose. The war was over, but the life sentence had just begun.